There's no denying there was once a time when Ubisoft were pioneers in the realm of crafting open-world games. They may never have made the best in the business, but boy, they can make them in a timely abundance. Many Ubisoft games have made a stamp on the open-world genre. The problem, of course, is Ubisoft have always loved their shortcuts. They've created some fascinating rich worlds over the years, but then they compromise on any creative vision. Whether that be for sales, for a quick turnaround, anything that demonstrates loyalty to the bottom line over the product's integrity. What this ultimately means is Ubisoft became masters of creating blueprint games and then building an entire series thereafter on said blueprint, throwing an idea on it, a gimmick, dressing it up in a lovely bow tie, disguising the breakdown and understanding as to why the previous game was the way it was, and proclaiming, "Here, your much anticipated sequel." They've abused their winning titles for years now, repackaging them, selling experiences only marginally different, repeatedly, and perhaps on that front, they've had no better blueprint than Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 was so nice, they released it twice, no, thrice. Then they released it a fourth, fifth, and sixth time, and that's excluding wherever else they've applied this winning formula. Don't let superficial differences fool you. You can certainly make an argument for some of these games, they ain't bad. But, if you've played Far Cry 3, you've played all of them. This game was so well received, Ubisoft couldn't help but keep doing Far Cry 3s, and in a way, who can blame them? Far Cry 3 is f***ing awesome. But the problem, of course, was that every time it'd trade away pieces of what made Far Cry 3 so compelling, in exchange for a miserable void where the soul of the game should be, ultimately resulting in subsequent experiences slightly worse than the last. This decade-long bastardization of Far Cry 3, of course, was due to Ubisoft's business model becoming increasingly unsustainable, exposing the practice of manufacturing games that required the least logistics to carry a product from ideation to the shelves, while for every other company and studio under the sun, releasing sequels became a multi-year long challenge to accomplish. Considering Ubisoft's seemingly limitless fall from grace, it's hard to remember Far Cry 3 was even all that good, and yet, here we are. The original Far Cry 3, actual Far Cry 3, Far Cry 3 before Far Cry 3 became a descriptive term for uninventive Ubisoft games way too similar to Far Cry 3. Is it as good as I remember? Let's find out. I know I'm supposed to hang on to my conclusion until the end, but like an old dog, I'm going to put you out of your misery. Yes, Far Cry 3 is every bit the guerrilla warfare Rambo simulator it sets out to be. It's a game about a group of rich, privileged Americans going on some far-flung holiday and ending up squarely in a pirate-infested nation where they're captured to be sold into slavery by a mentally well chap named Vaas. Among the captives, we've got Jason Brody, the protagonist. At first he's frightened, on the back foot. Alone, afraid, and at the mercy of a massive pirate force, Jason manages to escape at the expense of his brother's life and gets some sick ink. As a result of this sick ink, Jason becomes an absolute pirate-killing machine on a mission to save his friends and take down as many pirates as possible. Nothing will stop him. He becomes a force to be reckoned with, a one-man army that will stop at nothing to bring Vaas down and kill as many of his mates as possible along the way. It's a coming-of-age story. He arrived on the Rook Islands an aimless yet gifted boy. He seems to have skipped to the becoming a man part of that story, and now he's just a beast. And that is the bulk of his character arc. And what makes that special is Far Cry 3 is one of few games where the main protagonist's intentions actually line up perfectly with the players. It's hard to deny a good gripping story can make any game compelling, but the game is still going to be defined by its interactive element, and it's such a common thing for games to not marry interactive and non-interactive elements particularly well that it's not even remarkable to point out. What's remarkable about Far Cry 3 then is that its narrative and gameplay are harmonious. There are many games out there that will throw a gameplay loop of violent mass murder paired to a narrative that barely addresses it, if ever, and I'm sure you can think of countless examples and don't need me to list them. Some of these games aren't even all that bad. Some of them are some of the best games you could possibly play. But what makes Far Cry 3 the definitive Far Cry game in my opinion is the fact that while its gameplay is about the vicious cycle of violence, its narrative is also about the vicious cycle of violence. The gameplay of Far Cry 3 is punctuated heavily by the violence. Jason arrived on this island a sheltered young man with no real experience of this degree of it. Vars, the game's secondary antagonist with whom we share our first interaction, comparatively is utterly insane. A wild beast in the body of a man with a mohawk. He has no problems killing. He has no civility. He cannot be reasoned with, and his methods are impossible to understand. He's aggressive, explosive, unpredictable, and thrives off of the fear he instills, and Jason, at first, is paralysed by this, and all he can hope to do is run away. His escape leads him to a fella named Dennis, whose name gives me sad flashbacks.
I am Dennis.
That's a lie. You could never be him. He decided to tattoo Jason in his sleep because that's just what you do to Western tourists, I suppose. And it's with Dennis that Jason and the player develop their taste for blood. As Jason becomes more comfortable gunning down and stabbing pirates, the game gets easier as the player also adjusts to this. As our skill set rapidly develops and we unlock abilities, Jason is also coming to grips with more than just the basics of ending the lives of men. Perhaps there is some abruptness to it, after all it's still a game. But the general premise is, under the tutelage of the Rakyat, Jason develops into a warrior, and we, the players, also become more comfortable taking on compound after compound of angry murderous pirates. We pick up new skills, new killing abilities. Every skill has a practical application or some form of tangible benefit, and they come together to mould us into an absolute predator, while Jason is also being moulded into the same thing. It's haunting how quickly Jason gets comfortable with the bloodshed. He even becomes outright bloodthirsty as the plot develops. He becomes so accustomed to the art of killing, the narrative heavily alludes to the fact that he starts to enjoy it. It's almost like it's a game to him, which again brings his actions in line with the players, considering it is actually a game, and the narrative conveys the shift in Jason's character with the camps of characters, of which there are two primarily. You have Jason's friends, the people who knew him prior to the narrative, whom we rescue and gather in a cave beneath the psychedelic doctor's house over the course of the story, who noticed the dramatic dark shift in Jason's personality. The other camp are the inhabitants of the island who come to know Jason, those who recognise the warrior within him and come to appreciate him for being that monster, even encouraging him to immerse himself deeper into the role. At first they seem normal, albeit warped by the jungle, and Jason isn't necessarily torn between these two camps. Rather, he's being pulled towards the Rook Islands group, the Rakyat, who accept him for becoming this twisted killer, a thing he could never be back in Southern California. And Jason, as a directionless young man, is drawn to this hero status, lulling him into a sense that he belongs here. He matters here. That, however, is an illusion. The game highlights the Rakyat are no ordinary society. If that isn't clear through how they've warped Jason into a bloodthirsty maniac, they're also heavily into their hallucinogenics, and their leader Citra is absolutely mental, to put it nicely. But I actually think it's through Dennis where the craziness is exposed for what it is. At first he seems a pragmatic, handy ally, helping Jason out in his time of need, but as Jason earns Citra's trust, his nature is revealed to be that of a tragic, obsessed fanatic. A man entirely brainwashed by the cult he now belongs to. His own path representative of the slippery slope Jason is now enjoying. The point? Insanity seems reasonable at first. Slaughtering the pirates for fun seems like a measured response after watching them gun down Grant. But at what point does the killing with purpose become killing without purpose? If you develop a taste for something and that something is encouraged, chances are good you'll do more of it. Even in the times that you lose direction and purpose, it becomes habit. I mean, I started doing this over 10 years ago. Not killing people, at least as far as I'm allowed to disclose, but this YouTube thing. Do you think I'd be here if I didn't have the support of the viewership, people encouraging me to continue, people actually watching the content I produce? No, I'd have got a real job. That analogy is flawed in countless ways, but what is consistent is the input of others has significant influence on what we do with our time. For me, I existed in a vacuum of eating, sleeping, and shitting the internet, and I didn't get much outside input as I did that because I didn't go outside. Jason, similarly, is in a vacuum. He's on this insane island full of pirates and crazy mohawk serial murderers, and his only effective allies in the face of that are a death cult. Becoming like them is all he can do to survive and save his friends.
and as with anything that carries with it lifelong consequences, they'll be quicker to advertise the pros over the cons. And that's why Dennis at first seems like quite a reasonable bloke, but it doesn't take long for the game to heavily nod towards the idea that this probably couldn't be further from the truth. In his own way, he's probably just as broken as Vars, or at the very least, he's headed in that direction. Speaking of this game's antagonist, while he's not actually the game's main antagonist, that distinction goes to a South African fellow named Hoyt, despite being the game's poster boy, so I understand the confusion. Vars serves as a mirror to Jason's mental state. At first they exist in opposite corners, Jason being little more than a frightened tourist, and Vars being this insane murderous pirate leader, but the line between them that was initially broad becomes finer as the story develops. While that means his threatening aura dissipates, it also means Jason is becoming just as unhinged, just as at ease in this brutal environment, just as corrupted by the jungle, and Vars shifts from a petrifying villain to a rather pitiable, even pathetic figure. He's a lost soul, a wild animal that was once a man, to be used at the whim of his employer, Hoyt. And the most interesting detail is Vars recognizes this. In fact, he recognizes the vicious cycle of violence he's a part of. In his many villainous monologues, he ponders the philosophical definition of insanity. In his mind, it means doing the exact same thing over and over again, expecting things to change. Meanwhile, he's continuously trying to kill Jason, and every time he does, Jason only comes back stronger. And that is declaration of self-awareness of the fact that he's insane by his own standards. But the tragedy of that is the awareness implies he isn't actually insane at all. Nothing crazier than what Jason has experienced caused him. In fact, what Jason is experiencing did cause him. Vars was once the most powerful warrior among the Rakyat. Citra is his sister. The destiny that awaits Jason on this island is the destiny that Vars rejected. A future Jason comes closer and closer to embracing, as the jungle forces him to become more animalistic, more like Vars. That creates an interesting lifeline for Jason's character development as he's effectively fighting against his own future. A future where he's the puppet of Citra. A future where he is the vile, marauding tyrant. Do you think the bloodlust instilled within him will be sated upon the deaths of his enemies if he doesn't seize genuine control? Do you think if killing is all he knows, he'll even notice when the dust is settled? Or is it more likely he'll continue slaughtering because Citra points and says shoot, and he'll just become this haunted nation's next savage menace, waiting for a bigger fish to come along and topple him? After all, that's the fate that befell Jason's window into his own future. Or might he recognise and halt the cycle before it takes hold? Considering the gameplay is a reflection of Jason's development into this bloodthirsty lunatic, it's a very morbidly intimate experience. There's no denying the blatant Ubisoft in the gameplay loop is pungent. There are as many viewpoints as you'd expect in an Assassin's Creed game, and the world is furthermore littered with simple camps to raid and bounties to collect, and even with a story that lends meaning to them, they do get repetitive. However, that sense of relevance to our moment-to-moment activities does a lot of heavy lifting bringing this game together. Like I said, as we naturally become more skilled at the game, Jason is becoming more skilled. As we learn more advanced skills, Jason is learning more advanced skills. The sense of progression in Far Cry 3's gameplay loop is tethered to the storytelling, and as a result it feels earned. Starting out, Jason is a naive, helpless hostage whom we must protect, and over the course of doing that, he shifts from this scared boy to a virtually superhuman soldier. And as he mercilessly slaughters every pirate he encounters, as his methods become more advanced and efficient, his durability more resilient, wrapping up scrapes and digging bullets out of his arms every 5 seconds, burning weed farms and listening to dubstep, savouring every second of the bloodbath, he becomes a vengeful creature of fear, striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. In encounters, the pirates begin to panic. They're absolutely petrified of the demon they invoked, and while this only manifests in small, negligible ways like dialogue, that too feels earned. Simultaneously, the gameplay is also trying to represent a desensitization to the violence. Typically the players. I mean, violence is pretty standard in a lot of games like this. What else are you going to do in an action experience? Not kill people? It's not even a novel thing, we just accept that a lot of games are about this, and to be honest, I don't necessarily see a problem with it. I'm not part of the video games cause violence crowd because, in the end of the day, I like to think I'm not a f***ing idiot, though I suppose an idiot would. Nor am I going to necessarily propose that an avid gamer's emotional response to seeing violence might differ from, say, your nan's. But as an anecdote, I used to stay at my nan's for weeks on end, and in her living room, I'd be gaming pretty much non-stop. She had a vastly different emotional response to what she was seeing than I did. She loved watching wrestling though. The reason I bring this up is because while the jury's still out on whether or not our emotional response to violence is influenced by the bonkers media we consume, the game is certainly trying to draw a parallel between us and Jason here. He says so himself, the killing feels like winning. To him, this becomes a game, and to us it quite literally is a game, so we can see where he's coming from. By my own criteria, I would struggle to call Far Cry 3 an immersive experience. And by that I mean it's not the kind of game where your prolonged suspense of disbelief is at all integral to the game's point. For me, that means the entire time I was playing Far Cry 3, I was very aware of the fact that I was playing a game. At no point did I find myself crossing that boundary between being aware of reality and being utterly consumed by what was in front of me. For one, there's too much Ubisoft bollocks for that. There's a lot of picking up simple objectives with a notice board and side missions that have you partake in rather bland, if not nonsensical activities. You know, the kind of contrived scenarios you only find in games, therefore you're reminded you are playing a game. And while at times that doesn't do Far Cry 3's wealth of content any favours, I can't help but feel the repetition and monotony is deliberately often predictable to have us switch our brains off and mindlessly slaughter our way through the pirates. Because that is precisely Jason's emotional response to his activities too. When I say that, I'm fully aware I'm likely giving Ubisoft a tad too much credit. But like I said, Jason becoming numb to the experience is quite important to the storytelling at play, and us being in a similar situation does further that connection between the player and the character. Once you've got a few key upgrades, this game just becomes a blatant, even ridiculous at times, power fantasy. And that is very much so the illusion Jason is being fed by the Rakyat. Off the back of that, what convinces me so much about Far Cry 3 is its self-awareness. The game is a mind-numbing power fantasy at times to coincide with Jason being brainwashed. Jason is being manipulated into believing in his own power in this personally consequence-free environment, in a similar way to how games allow us to feel powerful, despite most of us, I'd assume, living very pedestrian lives, at least comparatively. After all, escapism is the allure of fiction. We disappear into a book, a TV show, a film, a game, about events that have never happened and never will. And for as long as we've still got pages to go, minutes to watch, objectives to complete and time to kill, we indulge in the fantasy. We become addicted to it. Jason is similarly addicted. And just like anyone, when they get addicted to fantasy, it becomes detrimental to their actual life. Jason is constantly reminded that this isn't actually his life. His life is back in Southern California. It's also not ours. To both the player and the character, it's an action hero fantasy. And that allows the game to critique the action tropes it also uses. The game possesses an awareness of its silly action. Is it at all believable that this snivelling kid could rise to match experienced pirates and mercenaries in battle prowess over the course of a lad's holiday? Probably not. Yet Jason is mopping the floor with everyone like he's been doing it his entire life. As for the characters, are they sane and convincing? Not especially. The American spy guy Willis is ridiculously over the top.
You have 10 seconds to tell me who you are before I remotely detonate the C4 under the table and this whole place explodes like a pop bottle.
Jesus!
I doubt it. 5 seconds.
One of the villains, Buck, is a crazy Australian. One of our allies, Sam Becker, is a CIA agent that managed to sell his cover with his menacing German accent. The absurdity of Citra is obvious. Even Jason himself is a walking critique of the white savior trope. Far Cry 3's characters reliably often hit absurd benchmarks, and to me this helps hit home the point that this is a critique of itself. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a parody, but blatantly ridiculous when the situation demands it, certainly. But there are more striking examples of the absurdity, even still. Look at this world, the Rook Islands. They're absolutely stunning. Gorgeous tropical landscapes, golden, sandy beaches, potent greenery until we set it on fire at least, and glorious, attractive blue water. This game's setting is strikingly gorgeous, and that exists in contrast to how dark these isles truly are. This is a game where we slaughter our way through paradise. We're liberating it from these pirates, but in a way we're conquering it. We utilize radio towers as viewpoints to get a lay of the land. We assault patrols, we liberate camps, replacing the pirate footholds with our own. And yet the challenge the island sets us runs deeper still, as we also upgrade our equipment by contending with the local exotic wildlife. Slaughtering endangered species because the game says that's the only way we can upgrade something. That's ridiculous, but you can logically come to the conclusion Jason is setting himself the challenge to utterly dominate this landscape. And sure enough, he needs resources and bucket loads of honed skills to take on compound after compound of pirates. So why wouldn't he venture out into the wild to become an apex predator? Maybe he just wants an unnecessary shark skin wallet. Maybe he uses crafting a tertiary weapons holster out of an endangered species skin as a communication of his brutal, merciless prowess. Maybe he just likes throwing hand grenades at nature for fun. There's not a facet of these lands that we can't touch on our mission to purge the place of Vars and his mates. The viciousness is scarring the landscape as much as the people occupying it, and that allows Far Cry 3's world to be reasonably compelling despite being littered with reasonably formulaic content. That being said, it's no bland space. There are plenty of landmarks, particularly leftover bits of infrastructure from World War II, that suggests the Rook Islands do have a history. Chancing upon the corpses of Japanese soldiers from multiple decades ago, reading letters piecing together what they were doing here and what happened, springs to mind as one example where the world actually convinced me, and there's something oddly peaceful about soaring above it on a glider. At this height, the Isles do look like paradise. You can see why Jason and his friends came here to begin with. It's beautiful. The seductive appeal of the region from a safe distance expertly disguise the horrors that await within, allowing us to understand how Jason literally landed in this mess. And I suppose he does go treating his killathon like a holiday after the fact, and I'm sure there's a commentary in that. But the point I'm overall getting at is Far Cry 3, despite the Ubisoft game overall exterior, is genuinely captivating. We have a story that links the player to the character we're playing as, this mental world that serves as the backdrop but also furthers the commentaries. We have a tragic, fascinating villain whose performance was delivered so resoundingly he became the face of the game, and that became a recurring theme of subsequent Far Cry titles. In short, there's a lot going for this game that was achieved very deliberately. But I wouldn't want to misrepresent the game as perfect, because if there ever has been a perfect game, Far Cry 3 isn't it. You see, after Vars's death about 2/3 of the way through the story, and Jason turns his focus to Vars's employer Hoyt, I think the storytelling does fizz out somewhat. Firstly, Hoyt has to fill Vars's shoes, and those aren't boots you'll have an easy life filling. Not only is he a less personal target for Jason, he's also a far more generic warlord archetype. While Vars was a warped, tragic character that we could, in this story setting, relate to, Hoyt is a cold, calculating, evil businessman with unethical principles, and as a result, his correlation with Jason is more obscured. So while the mirroring is undoubtedly weaker here, it's still present. After all, Vars was Hoyt's puppet, and as Vars warns us, Jason is Citra's. That makes Hoyt's role as the true main antagonist not just important but essential to the storytelling. But quite depressingly, Hoyt doesn't command anywhere near as much presence as Vars did, and that vacuum is noticed. The sad part is, that's unavoidable. We have to go through Vars to get to Hoyt, and so, for the story being told to end, it needs to dial back its potency. You can understand, even foster a healthy hatred for Hoyt per his point, but considering how much of the story prior to this point is the collision course between Jason and Vars, now that collision has come and gone, that sense of aimlessness integral to the cycle of violence the game is highlighting has to manifest, and to further highlight Jason's detachment from reality, having Hoyt be overshadowed by his underling is an effective albeit unfortunate method. On the one hand, Hoyt is a far scarier and more sinister villain than Vars was, but on the other that doesn't necessarily make him more impactful. Hoyt's problem is he does carry less gravitas, and the reason for this is his presence is compartmentalized entirely from Vars's. We do see him at the start of the game, but his presence is incredibly limited until we're through Vars, and it's only then that the game allows him to take center stage. And that means we've got to do a lot of characterization in about half the time that Vars got, and then this guy's got to satisfyingly culminate the game. And considering he's a villain that's largely tacked on, or at least feels that way, he doesn't do an awful job, but at no point does he command the room the way Vars did. The most important aspect to him is how the final confrontation sends Jason into a blind frenzy. only for him to come to having slaughtered Hoyt and a room full of soldiers, recognizing the monster he's become. And that still isn't the final moment of the game, as Jason now has to rescue his younger brother Riley, whom Hoyt had been keeping in his basement. Above all else, in the final act, it's the formatting that's incredibly sloppy. And then because the game still isn't over quite yet, Hoyt is diluted by the moment-to-moment events themselves. I do think there's some intention to it. Overcoming Vars felt like a triumph, true vindication, and I think on some level you aren't really meant to feel much of anything for killing Hoyt. But we also don't sit on the realization of Jason's that he's become a monster. We have to rush to an airstrip to save Riley before he's shipped off to some far-flung part of the world to begin a life of slavery. We have to contradict the realization and continue to be the monster. And then once that's done, we've got to escape on a helicopter and bring holy hell down upon Hoyt's privateers. And then the game's got to give us a conclusion with the Rakyat, and it's here that their culty ways are truly exposed. First they kill the psychedelic doctor bloke, which is a big mistake on their part. I quite like that guy. But Citra's also taken all of Jason's friends. She drugs us so she can prepare them for ritual sacrifice, and it's here that we're presented with a choice that both works and doesn't at the same time. Simply put, the choice we ultimately get is to kill all our friends and stay, or rescue our friends and leave. We can either break the cycle and go home to our ordinary lives, or we embrace the fantasy. This works because it puts control in the player's hands. Do we, after having been on this journey with Jason, choose to bid to reclaim our humanity, or do we want to continue living the illusion, accept the indoctrination, and become the very thing we were fighting against in Vars? For me, that choice was simple. I decided to save my friends, to have Jason leave with them, to have Jason break the cycle, leave the jungle behind, and return to his ordinary life, and that felt fitting, even rewarding, because Jason is committing to not being the Rook Island's next tyrant. This choice also doesn't work because the options are extremes. Either Jason frees his friends and leaves with them, or he kills them all and stays. And that's weird to me because while the island does an awful lot to Jason, shifting his personality monumentally, it never really warps his compassion for his friends. So the ending decision boils down to a choice that Jason could sensibly make, and a choice that exists only for the players who are curious as to what might happen. So it isn't really a choice at all, it's just in one moment locking in the good ending or locking in the bad one. And the game is very quick to let you know it is the bad ending. That, however, is not to say I don't get the intention. I absolutely do. Jason and the player become harmonious over the course of this story, so leaving the ultimate decision in the player's hands means that Jason and the player are both making that choice. But in creating that opportunity, they equally create an opportunity for the player to at the last moment entirely derail the ending. And I suppose that's a bit funny, but it isn't that big of a sin in the grand scheme of things. After all, the game does make a great argument for Jason's desire to stay in these islands, so it isn't the biggest stretch to assume he'll ultimately do whatever it takes to secure that future. Even if either way Jason is denied that in the end, whether by himself or Citra, and the game does try to make that unrealistic immersion in the fantasy appealing to the player as well. As a depraved tropical mass murderer, we get to do fun game shit. We can practically do what we like. In this jungle, we are king, and we're worshipped for that absolutism. The gameplay and story are both appealing to an incredibly striking desire. The ending is a litmus test for whether we see it as our new reality, or if we'll accept the time has likely come to leave Wonderland. After all, the game isn't throwing Alice in Wonderland quotes at us for no reason. So Far Cry 3's ending is a weird one. The game makes an argument for both choices over the course of its narrative, and then it formats those choices in a way that it's very obvious which one it wants you to make. So the impact of there being a choice at all becomes net neutral. That doesn't stop Far Cry 3's story from being fantastic, but when people say it sort of comes undone after we're done with Vars, I can see where they're coming from. Ultimately though, I still think Far Cry 3 is brilliant. It still carries the flaws you'd expect to see in a Ubisoft game, but at least it does something with them. It gives them a purpose. We're given a story that formats the gameplay in such a way that it feels like it carries value, even when within itself it doesn't do anything particularly special most of the time. You can see why Ubisoft saw a winning formula in it. You can see exactly why Far Cry sequels draw heavily from the ideas it establishes. But the systems themselves weren't what made Far Cry 3 stand out. It's got some fairly standard weighted shooter gameplay with some stealth elements and a lot of stabbing people, and an open world full of things to do and excuses to go shooting and stabbing people, I suppose. But Far Cry 3 isn't just that. Nor is it a charismatic, eye-catching villain pontificating corrupted philosophy. It's the fact this is a game that takes itself for the most part entirely seriously, yet possesses a rich self-awareness of how ludicrous it actually is. And that isn't something you can replicate as easily, nor is it something you should bid to replicate too often. It's a gameplay loop that can be thoroughly enjoyed at shallow depths, but there's significantly more to see if you dig deeper. That won't entirely absolve it of its Ubisoft-isms, but it does cast them in a far more forgiving light. As it turns out, it has a gameplay loop that's unsurprisingly quite fun. But one advantage it has over many titles like it, many of which released by the very company that published it, in the same franchise even, is that Far Cry 3 has a soul. And that matters more than anything. I thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon.